Stage is yours.
Thanks a lot, Max. I hope you can all hear me well. So I would like to tell you a little bit about Inosca. Inosca is the name of a community of Swiss cantons that collaborate on software that deals with building permit apps.
Just have a special setup.
I don't need the speaker notes.
Yeah, it's okay, give me 1 second.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, good. Thank you. All right. So my name is Christian. I'm a software engineer working at Adfinis in Bern. Maybe a quick word about Adfinis. Adfinis is an open source service provider with about 100 employees, mainly based in Switzerland, but also with offices in Germany, in the Netherlands, and in Australia. The company offers system engineering related services in the cloud native space, but also in classic space, Linux and stuff. And I work in the development value stream. But I'm here to talk to you about Inosca, which I already mentioned is the name of the community, and EBAU, that is the name of the product that the community is building together with us. Some of you might have been in contact with the software when you were filing a building permit application or a related thing in one of those cantons. I also quickly still added the screenshot to the presentation earlier because we heard something about geodienste.ch. We have like a small link to that in the sense that when you're submitting your application, you're usually supposed to localize it on the map, and that's where we interface with the cantonal GIS systems, and where we might also start using geodienste.ch more in the future. But this EBAU software is not just submitting the application and maybe eventually hearing back if it's accepted or not. It's also covering the whole process that is going on sort of behind the scenes in the municipalities, but also in the expert offices in the cantons. So the whole process is basically covered in that web application. Everybody's on the same platform and data can be exchanged relatively seamlessly. The community that is building this software, as I said, is called Inosca, and it consists of 5 different cantons. You can see the logos there. There are some small cantons, but also some bigger ones in there. And I would like to tell you a little bit also about the history, how this all came about. For us at Adfinis, the story of EBAU started in around 2011 with the small canton of Uri. As you know, sometimes it's easier to get started digitalizing something when we don't have 1 million users and 1 million inhabitants. So Uri was, I would say, a very early adopter there. And for us, it was sort of, for a long time, an individual software development project. So the person responsible there has a very strong drive to push things forward, and he would tell us, we need this feature, doesn't matter if you understand why or not, but let's get it built, and that's what we were doing for quite some time. And then, around 7 years later, the cantons of Bern and Schwyz made a public tender to digitalize their building permit process. And that's when we won those tenders based on that software of the canton of Uri, that's when it became sort of more interesting to us, or we had to get deeper into the business of these building permit applications. We had to understand what are the fundamental similarities between those different cantons, but also what are the fundamental differences. And there are, unfortunately, some that you can't just discuss away by saying, let's do it the same way. And that's when we started to build something shareable, like to try to increase the amount of code that you can use between all of those cantons, and when we also realized we have to start modernizing the technological foundation that is running below all of that. Before that, it was sort of, the end of life was approaching. And now we're already 1 year ahead of the last number that I have on this slide here. 2 more cantons joined, that's Graubünden and Solothurn, and now we sort of reached that step with them where we have this modernized code base, we have a unified development process, and we have a sort of a reference implementation. If you are a Swiss canton and you don't have this digitalized yet, it's relatively easy to get started with this because of all the groundwork the other cantons were laying. Maybe I'll also go back for 1 second. What I want to say with this also is this is a massive amount of time, right? About 12 years we were on this journey, and it also took us quite some time to realize what can you share and what is different. And I think a learning is if you want to build an open source community in a similar setting to this, stuff takes time and you will have to iterate and talk with people, get them together on the same table and make them share ideas and discuss how can we solve something together. Now, what made this successful? I would say it's roughly 3 different aspects. One aspect for such a collaboration to be successful is you need to have a shared business problem, in the sense that if you're trying to do something somewhat related, but in the end ultimately different, then you're not going to be able to benefit that much from each other. In our case, I would say it's roughly 80 to 90% the overlap between the different cantons, and that's, I would say, a really good number, because then you can share most of the work. Second thing is you need to share technology. We used to have a situation where the amount of shared technology was much less, and that would mean that people come together, they have the same business problem, but they are not able to collaborate really, because they can basically just say, yeah, I have the problem, I have it as well. How do you solve it? Yeah, do it like this. Okay, we'll do it somewhat similarly, but we end up doing the work ourselves again. But if you have a shared foundation, you can actually tell your vendor, maybe, can you build this for us? We're going to share the costs. And that's effectively what we're doing in this community. So of course, depending on the philosophy of the vendor, not super interesting as a business model, because all of a sudden your customers come together and say, we're not going to pay full price for this, each of us, right? That's why you also need the third factor, which is sort of the culture mindset factor. I called it here open mindset, and that is needed both at the cantons or at the customer side, but also at the supplier side. So, as I said, we're an open source software provider, and for us it came naturally. In fact, we suggested this development model to the cantons, and that's why it also works. If you are like a proprietary software vendor, you would not be interested in bringing all your customers together on the same table and have them form sort of an alliance to put pressure on you. That's not interesting. 2 quotes that maybe illustrate this open mindset. The best solutions are created together. I would say the people involved in this community really believe that. And the second one, we share the solutions openly. And by openly, I also mean we're not asking another canton money if we spend money on a specific feature and that canton wants to use it now. The idea behind it is software gets better from sharing instead of worse, in the sense that when you have multiple cantons using your feature, then you can also share maintenance costs, you can share improvements to the feature and stuff like that. And with that, I would like to change the viewpoint a little bit. This was like the canton's perspective. Now I want to go a bit more technical and maybe talk from our perspective as a software provider. What we're trying to do in our daily development is sort of to get this picture of an open source software architecture. What do I mean by that? So I have a little diagram here. You can see on the axis on top are specific software components, and below are universal software components. By universal, I might mean a database, a programming language, web framework, stuff like that, libraries. On top is the stuff that you need to make your customer happy or to make your business requirements satisfied. And usually, or often, I see projects that look somewhat like this. On top, you have closed source software, highlighted in blue, that you're maintaining yourself, which is the dashed lines. And below, you have open source software that you're consuming, in a sense that you're not maintaining it yourself. And what we like to do, or what we try to encourage in our work, is to break up this picture a little bit, such that it looks more like the one on the right. You can see the total amount of green blocks has increased, so there's more open source software. But there are also some green blocks which have dashed lines around it, which means you maintain them yourself. So the idea is basically look for, in those big blue things, for smaller green chunks that you can cut out, make reusable, and maintain yourself as open source components. And by the reduced amount of blue stuff you see, that you have to write less code for a new customer project, which is not open source and not reusable. To get a little more specific about the Inosca community, the picture looks somewhat like this. We are very lucky because in our case, the entire graph on the right is green, so our customers agreed to open source the whole thing, which is very nice. That's the layer on top. Same name as the community, Inosca, or the EBA application, you can find it on GitHub. In the middle layer are some interesting things, which are, like, I would say, not super typical for open source projects, because they are like this in this middle abstraction level. They have opinions, they have user interfaces, but they are so generic that you can integrate them in different settings. For example, we build a framework for forms and workflows, sort of if you have an administrative process, you can use that to build an application around that. We have built modules for document management, user management, and maybe also a module where you can generate documents from templates with, I would say, typical business software stuff. And below that, of course, I think it's more common, some libraries, in this case, examples from the front-end framework we use, Amber.js, that complement universal stuff. All right. Now, the next thing that I'd like to touch on is the business model behind all this. You might wonder, if everything's open source, how do you make money with it? This is a question that people ask first when they hear about open source, but I think the answer is pretty obvious. In our case, the cantons pay for this work. We've seen those graphs already. Max introduced them in the beginning. I'm going to go a little bit more detail, hopefully adding still some value and not bore you with it. So here you see like this typical software startup business model, like the invest model, where you have in red the expenses, in green the revenue, and the sum of those two things is the black line, the profit line, where you see first you have a dip because you have to like spend some money or time to build your software until you can start to make money with it. And that money is usually made on subscriptions, in the sense that eventually you hopefully reach a break-even point, and afterwards you don't have to build that much software anymore because it's there, but your users still pay subscriptions, so you get rich. That's the idea. And your investors, of course, they are also really interested in that because they can get rich themselves. Now, contrasting to that is the open source business model. It's sort of a similar idea, right? It also starts with an idea for a product, but you're not convincing your investor in the beginning. Instead, you're convincing a potential customer, right? It's the same sort of discussion that you have to have, except one person's really going to use your software, that's the customer, versus some guy believes that there are users for that software. So it's sort of also a nice reality check. And with your first project, you start to get some income. You build the first version of the software, which would be this minimum viable product that we saw earlier. And at the same time, you also, of course, have costs for building that software. And the business model behind this is you charge basically by the hour. In your hourly rate is hopefully some margin, which can make your company slowly but steadily grow over time. And you can see by this, there's not so much risk involved. If your startup fails, you don't have the massive debt to repay, or your investors will not get super angry because there are none in this sense. Basically, the people who finance projects with you, they are your stakeholders, and hopefully you make them happy at the end of the project you did with them. So maybe to contrast those two models quickly, concerning different aspects. If you say, what's the source of revenue? I mentioned it. On the one hand, you have licensing fees. On the other hand, you have primarily projects, I would say, but also it can be support or hosting that you might offer. We've seen examples for this today. Second aspect, what's your competitive edge? This is an interesting one in my opinion, because usually people think if you build software, the software itself is your advantage, because you keep it super secret. The intellectual property that you build up is sort of your asset, right? And if you are in this open source world, then you don't have this asset anymore, and instead you need something else to set you apart. And I think that's actually the more valuable thing, is the ability to work with the software you build in a quick and efficient way. So just having the code, if it's sufficiently complex, I think everyone who's working in code might agree with me, it's not worth that much. The skills around it are really useful. And of course, if you build a customer relationship, you have your customer trusting you, you have a good collaboration, then that stands for a lot on its own. But you also have to keep always on your feet, because your competitor might come, use that code, and offer a similar offering to yourself, so you have to try to not get lazy when you're successful. Next aspect, who's making the decisions? I think it's also pretty clear in the invest model. It's basically the vendor together with the investors maybe. In the open source model, you have more control in the community, right? The community members can actually influence the direction a specific project is taking. And finally, whose interests are represented in the development model? This is also really interesting, I think, because we see that very often with software that we use maybe as a consumer. Often I have the feeling personally, my interests as an end user are like a secondary or even less concerned to the software vendor. They are more concerned with making money, maybe selling the data that I create by using their services to essentially create business value and make their investors happy. While in the open source model, it's the interests of the users and the customers, or in the sense the community members, which are represented. So I always think when I see a new service, and I know that company that built that service took 30 million venture capital, then I know that's future me paying them back if they manage to lock me into that service. So if there's no debt to repay, then I can be sort of assured as a user that my interests will be also represented in the future. All right, so these were a few aspects of the way we work with those cantons. And to sort of conclude, I would like to share some effects of this collaboration that we saw. Maybe first from the perspective of those cantons. So this is sort of surprising to me. People would usually say, okay, you save money, that's pretty obvious, right? You might have a reduced risk because you can sort of build on existing software instead of inventing it yourself. But if you ask our accountants what is the biggest advantage that you see in collaborating like this, they would probably say the first point, which is the discussions that they are able to have, the collaboration with those other accountants on a business level. So it's not even the software itself which is shared, but also that they can just basically say, so you solved it like that. Why did you do that? What were your experiences? And why did this work out for you? Thank you very much. We're going to do it exactly the same way, and then contribute back our experiences with that. So that is really, really interesting, sort of a second level effect of this collaboration. Further, they, of course, benefit from flexibility and a reduced vendor lock-in. We all know this. It's a major argument pro open source. They have an increased influence on the roadmap and the planning of those projects. And they also benefit from the transparency of this open source model. For example, that it allows for independent security audits. You can just send some security researcher the source code and they can do an in-depth review. But there are also super many advantages for us as a solution or software provider in that context. We noticed that we can work more efficiently. We have better collaboration between our independent project teams because they are using the same open source components as a foundation for the solutions they build. We have a more focused product portfolio because we can basically say now we have this framework for forms and workflows that we extracted out of our customer work. If your project fits this, then we are going to be able to develop something quicker, maybe than the competition is able to. We see an improvement in code quality and an improvement in the software architecture, as I touched on earlier. And of course, you mentioned it already, Max, as well, attractivity for employees. Open source is just really nice to work on. You can try to get your GitHub contribution graph as green as you can while being paid for it. What more do you want? And finally, we shouldn't forget the end users. They are also benefiting from this approach. They can see the source code. They can basically see the effect of the money of their taxes that where it went, and they can also check, is this application that the public administration built is it actually respecting my privacy? Also, they have the chance to participate if they would like to see something changed with this term civic tech, to really engage and contribute. If you have not heard of this public money, public code campaign by the Free Software Foundation, I would really encourage you to check out the website. There's a super nice video, it goes like 2 minutes, and it sums up very nice what I didn't even manage to say in 20 minutes now, what this whole thing is about. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, and maybe we can take a question.